In the pre-dawn hours of January 2026, Marcus Chen stared at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, watching the city slowly awaken below. The skyline stretched endlessly, a testament to human ambition, yet he felt smaller than ever. At 34, he had achieved what many considered success: a senior position at a prestigious consulting firm, a penthouse apartment, recognition from peers. But success, he realized, was not strength. Success could be taken away. Strength, true strength, was something entirely different. The year 2026 had arrived with unprecedented challenges. The global economy teetered on the edge of another recession, artificial intelligence had displaced millions of jobs, social media had fractured society into echo chambers of rage and victimhood, and political polarization had reached toxic levels. In this landscape, the weak were being systematically destroyed not by external forces, but by their own inability to adapt, their addiction to comfort, their desperate need for validation from others. Marcus had witnessed this destruction firsthand. Colleagues who had once seemed unstoppable were now paralyzed by anxiety, unable to make decisions without consensus from a committee. Friends who had built their identities around external achievements found themselves hollow when those achievements proved temporary. The modern world, with all its conveniences and safety nets, had created a generation of people who were technically successful but spiritually weak. The realization had come to him during a particularly brutal board meeting 3 months earlier. As he watched grown adults cower before criticism, deflect responsibility, and seek comfort in groupthink, he understood that the traditional paths to success were no longer sufficient. The future belonged to those who could embrace what Niccolò Machiavelli had understood 5 centuries ago, that strength comes not from being loved or even respected, but from being formidable. Machiavelli wrote in The Prince that it is better to be feared than loved, if one cannot be both. But this wasn't about inspiring fear in others, it was about conquering the fear within oneself. The Machiavellian approach to personal power wasn't about manipulating others, it was about developing such unshakable internal strength that external circumstances could never truly threaten you. Marcus began to study not just Machiavelli's political treatises, but the psychological principles underlying them. What made a person truly strong? What separated those who thrived under pressure from those who crumbled? The answer, he discovered, lay in a systematic destruction of weakness, not the weakness of others, but the weakness within oneself. The modern world had made people soft. Social media provided instant validation but also instant vulnerability to criticism. The economy rewarded specialization but punished those who couldn't adapt when their specialty became obsolete. Relationships had become transactional, based on what people could provide rather than genuine connection. In this environment, strength meant something different than it had for previous generations. Traditional strength had been about physical power, accumulating resources, or climbing hierarchies. But 2026 demanded a new kind of strength: psychological resilience, emotional independence, and the ability to thrive in chaos. This was the Machiavellian strength, not the crude domination of others, but the sophisticated domination of oneself. The process began with ruthless self-assessment. Marcus forced himself to confront every weakness, every fear, every dependency that made him vulnerable. He identified 3 categories of weakness that plagued modern people: emotional dependencies, intellectual limitations, and spiritual emptiness. Each required a different approach to overcome. Emotional dependencies were perhaps the most insidious. The need for approval, the fear of rejection, the anxiety about what others thought, these were chains that bound people more effectively than any physical restraint. Marcus observed how his colleagues made decisions based not on strategic value, but on how those decisions would be perceived. They chose safety over growth, conformity over excellence, popularity over respect. The first step in destroying emotional weakness was accepting that disapproval was inevitable. Not everyone would like his decisions, his methods, or his results. This wasn't a failure, it was a sign that he was making real choices rather than simply following the crowd. Machiavelli understood that a leader must sometimes act in ways that others find disturbing, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Marcus began practicing what he called strategic unpopularity. He made decisions based purely on their merit, regardless of how they would be received. He stopped explaining his choices to people who hadn't earned the right to understand them. He withdrew his energy from relationships that were based on his ability to please others rather than mutual respect. The results were immediate and uncomfortable. Some colleagues began to view him as cold or calculating. Friends who had grown accustomed to his accommodating nature felt rejected when he refused to participate in their dramas or validate their complaints. But something remarkable happened. The people who remained in his circle were of higher caliber. They respected strength even when it made them uncomfortable. Intellectual limitations were the second category of weakness. Most people operated from inherited beliefs, unexamined assumptions, and emotional reasoning rather than clear thinking. They were vulnerable to propaganda, manipulation, and self-deception because they had never developed the discipline of objective analysis. Marcus embarked on what he called intellectual warfare against his own biases and limitations. He studied subjects that challenged his worldview, engaged with ideas that made him uncomfortable, and forced himself to argue positions he disagreed with. He learned to separate his ego from his opinions, understanding that being wrong about something was information, not identity. This intellectual strengthening required consuming information from sources across the political and ideological spectrum, not to become confused or centrist, but to understand how different frameworks of thinking operated. He read conservative economists and progressive sociologists, ancient philosophers and cutting-edge researchers, studying not just what they concluded but how they reasoned. The goal wasn't to become a walking encyclopedia or to develop opinions on every subject. Instead, it was to build intellectual resilience, the ability to think clearly under pressure, to distinguish between fact and opinion, and to make decisions based on reality rather than wishful thinking. This was Machiavellian pragmatism applied to cognition. Spiritual emptiness was perhaps the most challenging weakness to address because it was the least tangible. Many successful people had developed their careers and relationships while remaining fundamentally hollow inside. They had achievements but no purpose, connections but no meaning, stimulation but no satisfaction. Marcus recognized that spiritual strength wasn't necessarily about religion, though it could be. It was about having a framework of meaning that existed independently of external circumstances. It was about knowing what he stood for, what he was willing to sacrifice for, and what would remain constant even if everything else was stripped away. He began developing what he called a personal doctrine, a set of core principles that would guide his decisions regardless of consequences. This wasn't about moral rigidity or ideological purity. Instead, it was about having an internal compass that couldn't be manipulated by others or distorted by circumstances. The doctrine included commitments to excellence over comfort, truth over popularity, growth over security, and self-reliance over dependency. These weren't just abstract ideals, they became practical guidelines for daily decisions. When faced with a choice, he would ask not what was easiest or most popular, but what was most aligned with his core principles. As 2026 progressed, the economic uncertainty that had been brewing for months finally erupted into full crisis. Industries collapsed, political tensions escalated, and social media became even more toxic as people sought scapegoats for their anxiety. But Marcus found himself oddly calm in the chaos. The internal work he had done, the systematic destruction of his weak self, had created a foundation that couldn't be shaken by external events. While his colleagues panicked about job security, he focused on building skills that would be valuable regardless of economic conditions. While others sought comfort in groupthink and tribal loyalty, he maintained his independence of thought and action. While friends wallowed in victimhood and blame, he concentrated on what he could control and influence. This wasn't about becoming heartless or sociopathic. If anything, the destruction of his weak self had made him more capable of genuine compassion and effectiveness. When he helped others, it came from strength rather than neediness. When he formed relationships, they were based on mutual respect rather than mutual dependency. When he took action, it was strategic rather than reactive. The Machiavellian approach had transformed not just how he operated in the world, but how the world responded to him. People began seeking his counsel during the crisis, not because he had all the answers, but because he had developed the rare quality of remaining clear-headed under pressure. His career advanced not through political maneuvering, but through demonstrated competence and reliability. But the real test of his transformation came when his company faced bankruptcy in late 2026. The leadership was paralyzed, employees were panicking, and clients were fleeing. In the chaos, Marcus saw an opportunity that others missed. While everyone else was focused on preserving what existed, he recognized that sometimes destruction was the first step toward reconstruction. He proposed a radical restructuring that would eliminate half the positions but position the company to thrive in the new economic reality. The proposal was initially met with horror. It seemed cruel, calculating, even Machiavellian in the worst sense. But Marcus had learned to distinguish between necessary strength and unnecessary cruelty. The restructuring wasn't about power or ego. It was about survival and adaptation. Those who were eliminated would be given generous severance packages and assistance finding new positions. But the company couldn't continue operating according to pre-crisis assumptions if it wanted to emerge stronger. The proposal was eventually accepted, not because it was popular, but because it was the only realistic path forward. Marcus was promoted to lead the restructuring, not because he was liked, but because he had demonstrated the strength to make difficult decisions while others remained paralyzed by the need to be seen as compassionate. As part one of his transformation concluded, Marcus reflected on what the destruction of weakness had actually meant. It wasn't about becoming cold or manipulative. Instead, it was about becoming genuinely powerful enough to act according to principle rather than emotion, to help others from strength rather than neediness, and to thrive in uncertainty rather than simply survive it. The man who had stared at his reflection in those windows months earlier, successful but weak, accomplished but vulnerable, no longer existed. In his place stood someone who understood that true strength came not from dominating others, but from becoming undominable himself. This was the first phase of the Machiavellian transformation, the systematic elimination of everything that made him weak. But destruction was only the beginning. Having cleared away the debris of his former self, he was ready for the second phase, construction. The question now wasn't just who he was no longer, but who he would become. The weak self was dead. Now it was time to build the strong self that would not only survive 2026's challenges but transform them into opportunities. The reflection in the window now showed a different man entirely, one who had learned the first great lesson of Machiavellian strength, that the greatest victory is not over external enemies, but over the weaknesses within oneself that make external enemies possible. Part 2, The Construction of Unbreakable Will. The bankruptcy proceedings concluded in March 2026, and Marcus found himself at the helm of what was essentially a new company. Half the staff was gone, most of the old systems had been dismantled, and the familiar hierarchies that once provided structure had collapsed. What remained was opportunity, raw, dangerous, and unlimited. This was when Marcus discovered the second principle of Machiavellian strength: destruction without construction is merely nihilism. Having eliminated his weaknesses, he now faced the more challenging task of building something powerful enough to withstand any future assault. This required moving beyond mere resilience to what he termed strategic invincibility. The construction phase began with a fundamental reframing of how he understood power itself. Most people thought of power as something external: influence over others, control of resources, position in hierarchies. But Machiavelli's true insight was that external power was always temporary and vulnerable. Real power was internal and absolute, the power to choose one's response to any circumstance. This insight crystallized during a particularly brutal confrontation with the company's largest client. The client, a multinational corporation, had used the bankruptcy proceedings as leverage to renegotiate their contract terms. They demanded a 60% reduction in fees while simultaneously increasing deliverables. Their negotiating stance was simple: accept these terms or lose the contract that represented 40% of the restructured company's revenue. The old Marcus would have felt trapped. The emotional response would have been either angry resistance or desperate accommodation. His staff certainly expected one of these responses. Several suggested immediate acceptance to preserve the relationship, while others urged defiant rejection despite the financial consequences. But Marcus had learned to see such situations differently. The client's attempt at exploitation wasn't a personal attack or a business setback, it was information. It told him exactly what they thought of his company's position and their own leverage. More importantly, it revealed their own weakness: they were operating from fear rather than strategy. Instead of reacting emotionally, he spent 3 days conducting what he called strategic archaeology. He researched the client's financial position, analyzed their other vendor relationships, and studied their market pressures. What he discovered was that their aggressive negotiating stance came from their own crisis. They were facing regulatory challenges that threatened their core business model. Armed with this intelligence, Marcus crafted a response that demonstrated the second phase of Machiavellian strength, turning apparent weakness into actual advantage. Rather than simply accepting or rejecting their terms, he proposed an entirely different arrangement. His company would accept the reduced fees but would also dramatically reduce the scope of services to match the deliverables they were demanding. Those would be available as premium add-ons at rates higher than the original contract. More importantly, he offered something the client actually needed but hadn't thought to request: specialized consulting on the regulatory challenges that were driving their cost-cutting demands. This wasn't a standard service his company provided, but Marcus had identified experts who could be brought in as needed. The proposal was elegant in its simplicity. If the client truly sought his company as a commodity vendor, they could have commodity-level service at commodity prices. But if they recognized the value of strategic partnership, they could access capabilities that would address their real problems rather than just their perceived cost pressures. The client was initially confused, then frustrated, then intrigued. The negotiation that had begun as an attempt at exploitation transformed into a genuine strategic discussion. By the end, they agreed to terms that were actually more favorable to Marcus's company than the original contract, while also positioning both organizations to address the regulatory challenges more effectively. This experience taught Marcus a crucial lesson about the construction of power. Strength isn't just about resisting pressure, but about transforming the nature of the pressure itself. The weak response would have been to accept victimization or to engage in a power struggle within the client's framework. The strong response was to change the framework entirely. This principle of framework transformation became central to his approach across all areas of life. When faced with seemingly impossible choices, he learned to question the assumptions that made those choices seem impossible. When confronted with zero-sum situations, he looked for ways to expand the game. When others saw only problems, he trained himself to see systems that could be reconfigured. The construction of this capability required developing what Marcus called compositional thinking, the ability to see situations as collections of elements that could be rearranged rather than fixed realities that must be accepted. Most people thought in terms of linear cause and effect. If X happens, then Y must follow. But complex systems rarely operated this simply. He began studying fields far removed from his professional expertise: game theory, systems thinking, behavioral economics, military strategy, and even improvisational theater. Each discipline offered different frameworks for understanding how elements combine to create outcomes, and how those combinations could be deliberately altered. From game theory, he learned to identify the hidden rules governing any situation and to recognize when those rules could be changed. From systems thinking, he developed the ability to see feedback loops and leverage points that weren't obvious to linear thinkers. From behavioral economics, he understood how cognitive biases created exploitable patterns in human decision-making. From military strategy, he learned the importance of positioning, timing, and the concentration of force. From improvisational theater, he developed comfort with uncertainty and the ability to build coherent narratives from unexpected inputs. This multidisciplinary approach wasn't about becoming a dilettante or showing off intellectual range. Instead, it was about developing cognitive flexibility, the mental equivalent of physical agility. Just as an athlete cross-trains to develop overall fitness rather than just sport-specific skills, Marcus was cross-training his thinking to handle whatever 2026 might demand. The practical application of this training came during the company's expansion phase in mid-2026. With the client relationship stabilized and cash flow restored, Marcus faced decisions about how to grow. The conventional approach would have been to hire back some of the eliminated positions and gradually rebuild the old structure. But conventional approaches were designed for stable environments, and 2026 was anything but stable. Instead, Marcus designed what he called a network organization, a core team of essential functions surrounded by a flexible web of contractors, partners, and temporary specialists who could be activated as needed. This structure required more sophisticated coordination than traditional hierarchies, but it also provided unprecedented adaptability. When the artificial intelligence revolution accelerated beyond all predictions in summer 2026, eliminating entire categories of white-collar work, Marcus's network organization was positioned to capitalize rather than just survive. While competitors struggled to retrain or replace displaced workers, his flexible structure allowed rapid integration of AI capabilities while redeploying human talent to areas where creativity and judgment remained essential. The key insight was that strength in 2026 required thinking in terms of capabilities rather than roles, relationships rather than positions, and adaptation rather than optimization. The old model of organizational strength, deep specialization, clear hierarchies, and process optimization was designed for predictable environments. But 2026 was fundamentally unpredictable. This same principle applied to personal development. Marcus had initially focused on eliminating weaknesses, but the construction phase required building adaptive capabilities rather than just fixed strengths. Instead of becoming exceptionally good at specific skills, he developed what he called metaskills, the ability to rapidly acquire and integrate new capabilities as circumstances demanded. One metaskill was pattern recognition across domains. By studying how similar challenges manifested in different fields, he could identify solutions that weren't obvious within any single domain. When the company faced a cash flow challenge, he applied lessons from military logistics about resource allocation under uncertainty. When dealing with a difficult team dynamic, he used insights from family therapy about systems change. Another metaskill was strategic patience combined with tactical speed. Most people were either impulsively reactive or paralyzingly deliberative. But complex environments required both careful analysis and rapid execution, depending on the specific circumstance. Marcus learned to distinguish between decisions that required extensive consideration and those that demanded immediate action. Perhaps most importantly, he developed what he called anti-fragility, the ability to become stronger through stress rather than just surviving it. This concept, borrowed from the philosopher Nassim Taleb, became central to his approach. Instead of building resistance to specific challenges, he built systems that could extract value from uncertainty itself. When rumors began circulating in late 2026 about potential government regulation of consulting services, most firms began defensive preparations, lobbying against the regulations, building legal defenses, and trying to preserve existing advantages. But Marcus saw opportunity in the disruption. Rather than fighting the regulatory trend, he positioned his company to benefit from it. He developed compliance consulting capabilities before the regulations were finalized, created transparency systems that exceeded proposed requirements, and designed service offerings specifically for the new regulatory environment. When the regulations were announced in November 2026, his competitors faced unexpected costs and constraints while his company faced new revenue opportunities. This response demonstrated the third phase of construction, turning external pressures into internal advantages. The weak approach was to resist change and try to preserve the status quo. The strong approach was to anticipate change and position oneself to benefit from it. But the Machiavellian approach was to help shape the change itself while building capabilities that thrived on the resulting uncertainty. By December 2026, Marcus's company had not only recovered from bankruptcy but had become one of the most respected firms in their industry. More importantly, the organization had developed what he called institutional unbreakability, the ability to not just survive disruption, but to transform it into competitive advantage. But the true test of his construction efforts wasn't organizational, it was personal. As 2026 drew to a close, Marcus faced a crisis that threatened everything he had built. A former employee, embittered by the earlier restructuring, had compiled a dossier of information designed to destroy his reputation and career. The accusations included everything from financial impropriety to interpersonal cruelty, supported by selectively edited communications and testimony from disgruntled former colleagues. The accusations were sophisticated enough to cause serious damage even though they were ultimately false. In the pre-transformation period, such an attack would have devastated him not because of its truth, but because of his emotional vulnerability to others' opinions and his dependence on external validation. But the construction phase had prepared him for exactly this type of challenge. Instead of responding defensively or emotionally, he treated the attack as a strategic problem requiring systematic solution. He assembled a response team that included legal counsel, public relations specialists, and private investigators, but, more importantly, he approached the situation with the analytical clarity that had become his signature strength. The response was measured, factual, and devastating in its completeness. Rather than simply denying the accusations, Marcus provided comprehensive documentation that not only refuted them but revealed the systematic nature of their construction. He demonstrated how communications had been edited, how testimony had been solicited and shaped, and how legitimate business decisions had been reframed as personal vendettas. More importantly, he used the attack as an opportunity to tell a positive story about the company's transformation and the principles that guided its operations. The defense became an offense, turning a potential destruction into an affirmation of everything he had built. The attack failed completely. The former employee faced legal consequences for his false accusations, and Marcus's reputation was actually enhanced by the sophistication and integrity of his response. But the real victory wasn't external, it was the knowledge that he had become genuinely unbreakable. The man who had begun 2026 as technically successful but fundamentally vulnerable had constructed something unprecedented, a self that could not be destroyed by external forces because it drew its power from internal sources that no external force could touch. This was the completion of the construction phase, building not just resistance to attack, but the ability to transform any attack into a demonstration of strength. As he prepared for the final phase of his transformation, Marcus understood that he had achieved something that Machiavelli himself had advocated but perhaps never fully experienced, the position of being so strong internally that external circumstances became merely information rather than threats. He had constructed not just a successful career or organization, but an unbreakable will that would serve him regardless of what future challenges might emerge. The construction phase was complete, but the most sophisticated test lay ahead, learning how to use this newfound strength not for domination or self-protection, but for creation and leadership in a world that desperately needed examples of genuine power exercised with wisdom and restraint. Part 3, The Mastery of Strategic Dominance. January 2027 arrived with an unexpected revelation: being unbreakable was only the beginning. Marcus had spent the previous year destroying his weaknesses and constructing unshakable internal strength, but as he surveyed the landscape of ongoing global chaos, he realized that personal invincibility without strategic purpose was ultimately sterile. The final phase of Machiavellian mastery required learning to wield power not just effectively, but meaningfully. The world had not improved during his transformation. If anything, 2020's crises had metastasized into something more systemic. Economic inequality had reached levels that threatened social stability. Artificial intelligence had created technological unemployment faster than new opportunities could emerge. Political polarization had evolved beyond mere disagreement into mutual dehumanization. Environmental pressures were creating resource conflicts that traditional diplomacy seemed unable to address. In this context, Marcus began to understand that true strength required more than just personal resilience, it demanded the ability to create positive change in systems that seemed determined to destroy themselves. This was Machiavelli's ultimate insight, that power without purpose was merely sophisticated selfishness, while purpose without power was merely sophisticated impotence. The transition from construction to mastery began with a deceptively simple question: what was his power for? Having developed the ability to thrive in chaos and transform challenges into opportunities, he faced the more complex challenge of deciding how to use these capabilities in service of something larger than himself. The answer came through an unexpected source: his 15-year-old niece, Sarah, who had been struggling with severe anxiety and depression throughout 2026. Despite her intelligence and talent, she had become paralyzed by the constant stream of catastrophic news and social media negativity. She represented an entire generation that was inheriting a world that seemed designed to crush their spirits before they could develop the strength to change it. During a family gathering in February 2027, Sarah asked Marcus a question that changed his perspective: how do you stay so calm when everything is falling apart? Doesn't anything scare you anymore? The question forced him to articulate something he had never fully examined: that his strength wasn't just personal armor, but a responsibility. By developing the capability to remain clear-headed and effective in chaos, he had also acquired an obligation to help others develop similar capabilities. This wasn't charity or altruism, it was strategic necessity. A world full of weak, frightened, reactive people would eventually destroy itself, taking even the strong down with it. This insight led to what Marcus called the multiplication principle, the understanding that true mastery meant creating more masters, not just protecting oneself from the consequences of others' weakness. The Machiavellian leader didn't just survive and thrive, he created conditions that allowed others to develop their own strength rather than remaining dependent on his. The practical application began with his niece. Instead of offering conventional comfort or advice, Marcus began teaching her the systematic approaches that had transformed his own capability. He started with basic emotional regulation techniques, methods for observing her anxiety without being controlled by it, ways to distinguish between legitimate concerns and immediate-induced panic, practices for maintaining clarity during emotional storms. But, more importantly, he taught her the analytical frameworks that had enabled his own transformation. He showed her how to break down overwhelming problems into manageable components, how to identify what she could and couldn't control in any situation, and how to develop plans that accounted for uncertainty rather than assuming predictable outcomes. The process was surprisingly challenging. Teaching strength was more complex than developing it personally because it required understanding not just what worked, but why it worked and how it could be adapted to different personalities and circumstances. Marcus discovered that becoming a teacher of power required mastering the power itself at an even deeper level. Sarah's progress was gradual but unmistakable. Within months, she had transformed from a paralyzed, anxious teenager into someone who could engage with challenging realities without being overwhelmed by them. More importantly, she began developing her own innovations on the techniques he had taught her, adapting them to her generation's specific challenges and opportunities. The success with Sarah led Marcus to expand his teaching efforts. He began mentoring other young professionals in his industry, not through formal programs but through the kind of intensive, practical guidance that traditional education rarely provided. Instead of teaching them how to succeed within existing systems, he taught them how to analyze, adapt to, and ultimately reshape the systems themselves. This mentoring work revealed the third principle of Machiavellian mastery, that strategic dominance required thinking in terms of systems rather than just individual advantage. Most people, even successful ones, operated within existing frameworks and tried to optimize their position within those frameworks. But true power came from understanding how frameworks themselves could be altered. Marcus began applying this systems-level thinking to larger challenges. When the artificial intelligence revolution accelerated throughout 2027, creating unprecedented disruption across industries, he didn't just position his own company to benefit. He began working with educational institutions, government agencies, and other organizations to develop systematic approaches for managing technological transition. The work wasn't motivated by altruism, it was strategic necessity. If the AI revolution created mass unemployment and social instability, even successful companies would face an environment of political chaos and economic collapse. But if the transition could be managed in ways that helped people adapt and develop new capabilities, the resulting environment would be more stable and prosperous for everyone, including his own organization. This led to the development of what Marcus called transition accelerators, systematic approaches for helping individuals and organizations adapt to technological change rather than just surviving it. The programs combined practical skill development with the psychological resilience training that had been central to his own transformation. The accelerators weren't charitable programs, they were designed to be self-sustaining by creating value for all participants. Individuals gained capabilities that made them more valuable in the changing economy. Organizations gained access to talent that could help them navigate technological transition. Society gained increased stability and reduced conflict during a period of unprecedented change. The success of these programs brought Marcus to the attention of political leaders who were struggling to manage the social consequences of technological and economic disruption. But his engagement with politics revealed the fourth principle of Machiavellian mastery, that true power often required working around rather than through existing institutions. Government agencies, despite their good intentions, were structurally designed for stable environments and predictable challenges. They excelled at administering known solutions to familiar problems but were poorly equipped for adaptive responses to novel situations. Political leaders, regardless of their individual capabilities, were constrained by electoral cycles, partisan polarization, and bureaucratic inertia. Rather than becoming frustrated by these limitations, Marcus learned to treat them as design constraints that required creative solutions. He developed what he called parallel governance systems that could address societal challenges without requiring formal political authority or bureaucratic approval. The parallel governance approach involved creating voluntary networks of individuals and organizations that could coordinate responses to shared challenges more effectively than formal institutions. These networks operated according to the same principles that had guided his personal transformation: clear analysis of reality, systematic adaptation to changing circumstances, and the development of capabilities rather than just the accumulation of resources. One such network emerged around the challenge of technological unemployment. While governments debated universal basic income and retraining programs, Marcus helped coordinate a voluntary system where companies that were benefiting from automation provided funding and mentorship for individuals whose jobs were being eliminated. The system was more efficient than government programs because it connected displaced workers directly with employers who understood emerging skill requirements. Another network addressed the growing problem of social media-induced political polarization. Instead of trying to regulate or reform social media platforms, the network created alternative information sharing systems based on constructive dialogue rather than tribal conflict. These systems used sophisticated moderation and discussion techniques that helped participants engage with challenging ideas without descending into hostility. The parallel governance experiments were successful enough to attract international attention. Marcus found himself consulting with leaders across Europe and Asia who were facing similar challenges with technological transition and social cohesion. But this broader influence brought him face to face with the fifth principle of Machiavellian mastery: that sustainable power required understanding its own limitations. The temptation of influence was seductive. Political leaders offered him formal positions with significant authority. Corporate executives sought his guidance on strategic decisions that would affect millions of people. Media organizations wanted to amplify his ideas and approaches to global audiences. But Marcus had learned to distinguish between real power and the appearance of power. Formal authority was often more constraining than liberating, because it came with obligations to serve others' agendas rather than pursue optimal solutions. Public visibility could become a weakness rather than strength, because it made one vulnerable to the same kind of reputation attacks he had survived in 2026. Instead of seeking maximum influence, he focused on optimal influence, the level of impact that allowed him to create meaningful change without compromising the independence that made such change possible. This required developing what he called strategic invisibility, the ability to shape outcomes without becoming their visible cause. Strategic invisibility meant working through others rather than always taking direct action. It meant creating systems that could function without his ongoing involvement rather than becoming indispensable to their operation. It meant teaching principles rather than dictating solutions, so that his influence could multiply through other people's independent applications of those principles. The mastery of strategic invisibility was perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of his development. It required overcoming the ego gratification that came from public recognition and, instead, finding satisfaction in the knowledge that his ideas and methods were creating positive change even when he received no credit for it. By late 2027, the networks and systems that Marcus had helped create were operating independently across multiple continents. The transition accelerators had evolved into a global movement that was helping millions of people adapt to technological change. The parallel governance experiments had inspired similar efforts in dozens of other contexts. The principles he had developed through his own transformation were being adapted and applied by people he had never met to challenges he had never directly addressed. This was the ultimate test of Machiavellian mastery, creating change that could sustain and expand itself without requiring his ongoing control or intervention. True strategic dominance meant building systems that made him powerful rather than systems that made him indispensable. But perhaps the most significant validation came from an unexpected source. In December 2027, Sarah, now 16 and thriving academically and socially, told him that she had begun teaching the resilience and analysis techniques to her friends and younger students. She had adapted his methods for her own generation's specific challenges and was creating her own innovations on the fundamental principles. "I don't want to just be strong myself," she explained. "I want to help create a world where being strong is normal instead of exceptional." This was when Marcus realized that he had achieved something beyond personal transformation or even strategic influence. He had participated in the creation of a self-replicating system for developing human strength and capability. The principles and practices that had saved him from the weakness and vulnerability that characterized so many people in 2026 were now spreading through networks of individuals who were each adapting and improving them. The man who had begun this journey as a technically successful but fundamentally weak individual had become something unprecedented, a generator of strength in others. He had learned not just to be unbreakable himself, but to help others develop their own unbreakability. This was Machiavellian mastery in its highest form, power that created more power rather than just concentrating it. As 2028 approached, Marcus reflected on the complete transformation that had occurred over 2 years. The weak self that had stared helplessly at challenges he couldn't control was completely gone, replaced by someone who had learned to transform challenges into opportunities and, then, help others develop the same capability. The crises of 2026 had not disappeared; if anything, they had intensified. But the response to those crises had fundamentally changed. Instead of a world full of weak, frightened, reactive people making bad decisions out of desperation, there was now a growing network of individuals who had developed the strength to engage with difficult realities constructively. This was the ultimate insight of the Machiavellian approach, that individual strength, properly developed and wisely applied, could transform not just personal circumstances but the entire context within which those circumstances existed. The man who destroys his weak self does indeed become indestructible to others, not because he has isolated himself from others, but because he has developed the strength to help others become strong as well. The future remained uncertain. New challenges would undoubtedly emerge that would test both individual resilience and collective capability. But Marcus had learned that uncertainty was not a problem to be solved but a condition to be mastered. The principles and practices that had guided his transformation were not dependent on specific circumstances; they were designed to work regardless of what circumstances might arise. Standing again at his office window as 2027 ended, Marcus saw the same city skyline that had witnessed his initial transformation. But now he saw it differently, not as a testament to individual ambition, but as evidence of human capability to create complex, adaptive systems that could thrive despite uncertainty and change. The reflection in the window showed a man who had achieved something beyond mere success or strength. He had developed the wisdom to use power in service of something larger than himself, while maintaining the independence and capability that made such service possible. This was the completion of the Machiavellian transformation, not just becoming strong enough to survive in a hostile world, but becoming strong enough to help create a world that was less hostile to strength itself. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has learned the secret that weakness and strength are not individual conditions but systemic realities that can be deliberately transformed. In mastering this secret, he had not only saved himself, he had begun the process of saving everyone else as well. In the end, 2026 had indeed demanded strength, but not the crude domination that many associated with Machiavellian power. Instead, it demanded the sophisticated strength of those who could transform weakness into capability, chaos into opportunity, and individual resilience into collective wisdom. The future belonged not to the strong who dominated the weak, but to the strong who helped the weak become strong. This was the true Machiavellian way to win, by changing the game itself.